That gentle surprised expression of yours always delights me. Do I, the chronicler, sound different tonight? Surely. You're thinking smaller, somehow, yet filled with unexpected determination. You hear truly, my friend. Tonight's tale has awakened the voice of one who knows that size has little to do with the magnitude of one's heart. This voice belongs to one who has witnessed the courage that blooms in the most unlikely hearts, who has seen creatures dismissed as cowardly and weak rise to heroism that shames their larger, supposedly braver cousins. Tonight, I speak with the voice of someone who understands that the greatest adventures often begin not with legendary warriors, but with small souls who simply refuse to let fear decide their fate. So prepare to see the world through different eyes, friends, as I tell you all a kobold's courage. In the warren of caves beneath Greenfields, where the autumn rains had driven the kobold clans deeper underground than usual, young Meepo clutched his tiny spear with hands that trembled only slightly. The weapon had been crafted by his grandfather from the sharpest rib of a cave bear. Its point hardened in the sacred fires that burned eternally in the clan's deepest chambers. It was barely longer than a human dagger, but to Meepo's small frame, it felt like a legendary blade worthy of the greatest heroes. The elders had chosen him for this mission, not because he was the bravest or the strongest of his clutchmates, but because he was the smallest. Small enough to slip through the passages that would trap larger creatures, quick enough to escape if discovered, and perhaps more importantly, clever enough to understand the difference between courage and foolishness. The task seemed impossible. Infiltrate the Dragon Cult supply depot, discover what they were planning, and return with intelligence that might save not just his clan, but all the small folk who called Greenfields home. For a kobold barely past his naming ceremony, it was the kind of quest that belonged in the epic tales the clan's storytellers shared around evening fires. Stories of kobold heroes who had outwitted dragons and saved their people through cleverness rather than strength, who had proven that even the smallest creatures could change the course of history when they found the courage to act. But Meepo had advantages that even the elders didn't fully understand. Unlike his cousins, who had never ventured beyond the clan territories, he had spent months observing the cult's operations from hiding places they never suspected existed. The natural curiosity that marked him as different from his more cautious relatives had led him to explore far beyond the traditional boundaries of kobold territory. And what he had discovered had filled him with both wonder and terror. The humans who served the Dragon Queen were not the simple raiders that kobold legends described. They were organized, disciplined, and possessed a kind of focused purpose that made them far more dangerous than mere bandits or treasure hunters. They had established a network of camps and supply depots throughout the region, each one positioned to support operations that seemed to follow a carefully coordinated plan. Most troubling of all, they had begun recruiting among the kobold's clans themselves, offering protection and purpose to the tribes that had been struggling to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. Some clans had accepted these offers, abandoning their ancestral territories to serve as laborers and scouts for the cult's operations. The sight of his own people wearing the purple sashes that marked them as cult servants had filled Meepo with a mixture of shame and determination that drove him to take risks his elders would never have approved. The cult depot was housed in an abandoned watchtower that had once protected merchant caravans from bandits. The structure rose from a rocky outcrop, like a stone finger pointing toward the sky, its weathered walls bearing the scars of battles fought decades ago. Now, it served as a staging ground for operations that threatened every peaceful community in the region. Its chambers filled with weapons and supplies that spoke of conflicts to come. As Meepo approached through the pre-dawn darkness, he could see guards in purple robes walking predictable patrols, while Kobold laborers, members of clans that had allied with the cult, moved supplies under the watchful eyes of human overseers. The sight of his cousins reduced to mere servants filled him with anger that burned like the sacred fires of his clan's deepest chambers. The tower's base was surrounded by a crude palisade that would have been formidable to human attackers, but posed little challenge to someone of Meepo's size and agility. The spaces between the wooden stakes were just wide enough for a small kobold to squeeze through, and the guard's attention was focused outward, rather on threats that might already be inside their perimeter. He had studied their routines for 3 nights, memorizing the timing of their patrols and identifying the blind spots where someone could move undetected. The guards changed shifts every 4 hours, with a brief period of confusion as the new sentries received their instructions for those they were replacing. It was during one of these transactions that Meepo made his move. The palisade's wooden stakes were rough-hewn and provided numerous handholds for someone with claws designed for climbing rocky surfaces. He scaled the barrier with fluid grace that marked his people as natural climbers, pausing at the top just long enough to ensure that no one had noticed his approach. The courtyard beyond was dimly lit by torches placed at regular intervals. Their flickering light created pools of illumination separated by regions of comfortable shadow. Meepo dropped silently to the ground and scurried toward the tower's base, his movements guided by instincts honed through the generations of evolution that had favored stealth over strength. The entrance he sought was not the main gate, which was heavily guarded and well lit, but a narrow drainage culvert that allowed rainwater to flow out of the tower's lower levels. The culvert was barely wide enough for his small frame, and the journey through its length was a claustrophobic nightmare of rough stone and stagnant water. But it brought him into the tower's basement undetected, emerging in a storage chamber that was filled with a kind of mundane supplies that kept any military operation functioning. Sacks of grain, barrels of water, bundles of arrows, and coils of rope. But mixed among these ordinary materials were items that made Meepo's blood run cold with recognition and fear. Cages designed to hold captives, their bars stained with rust that might have been something else entirely. Ceremonial robes decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. And most disturbing of all, a collection of maps that showed not just the local region, but territories that stretched across half the continent. Each map was marked with symbols that indicated different types of operations, raids that had already been completed, communities that had been marked for future attention, and supply routes that connected the cult's scattered forces into a network of frightening scope. Meepo's limited understanding of human writing made it difficult for him to interpret all the details, but the overall pattern was clear enough to fill him with dread. It was not a simple bandit operation, or even a regional threat. The cult was planning something that would affect every community, every family, every individual creature that lived in freedom across vast areas of the known world. The depot he had infiltrated was just one small piece of a machine designed to crush everything that stood in the way of their dark goddess's return. Sound from the floors above indicated that the tower was far from empty, the footsteps and voices suggesting a significant number of cult members were present. Meepo's mission required him to gather as much intelligence as possible, which meant risking discovery by exploring the upper levels where the most important information was likely to be stored. The stairway that led upward was carved directly into the tower's stone walls, its steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Each footfall had to be placed with absolute precision to avoid the kind of echoing sounds that would alert the guards above. Meepo's natural ability served him well here. His clawed feet finding purchase on the ancient stone with the confidence of a creature born to climb. The first floor above the basement was clearly being used as a barracks, with bedrolls arranged in neat rows and personal equipment stowed in organised piles. The cult members who slept here were disciplined soldiers, rather than the chaotic raiders that Kobold legends described. Their gear maintained with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of professional military training. But it was the second floor that truly revealed the scope of the threat they faced. Here, the tower's original Great Hall had been converted into a command centre. Its walls covered with maps, charts, and documents that painted a picture of operations spanning multiple kingdoms. Tables were arranged to display detailed models of cities and fortifications, while racks held message tubes that spoke of communication networks extending far beyond the local region. At the centre of it all stood a massive table where the cult's local commanders planned their operations. The surface was covered with documents, written in multiple languages, some bearing official seals that suggested the cult had infiltrated legitimate government and military organisations. Others were covered with a kind of detailed diagrams that spoke of magical workings too complex for Meepo's understanding. But he understood enough to know that time was running short. The document spoke of timetables that had been accelerated, of operations that were moving into their final phases, of a great gathering that would bring together resources from across the continent for some ultimate purpose. Whatever the cult was planning, it was scheduled to happen soon, and the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone who opposed them. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Meepo to abandon his examination of the documents and seek concealment behind one of the map tables. The voices that accompanied the footsteps spoke in the common tongue, but with accents that suggested the speakers came from distant lands.
Ugh, the timeline has been moved up again,
one voice was saying with obvious frustration.
The Red Wizards are demanding faster progress, and Rezimir grows impatient with our explanations.
We are doing everything possible with the resources available, replied another voice, this one carrying the authority of command. But accelerating the operation means taking risks that could compromise our security.
Better to take risks than to face Rezimir's displeasure,
the first voice said grimly.
The last commander who disappointed her was fed to her personal drake, slowly.
The conversation continued as the speakers moved through the room, discussing logistics and timelines with the casual efficiency of people who had grown accustomed to organising violence on a massive scale. But what truly chilled Meepo was the way they spoke of their opponents, not as enemies to be defeated, but as obstacles to be removed with the same dispassionate efficiency they might apply to clearing rocks from a road. The Kobold clans have been useful, one of them noted, but their loyalty is questionable at best. Once the operation moves into its final phase, we may need to consider whether they're worth the resources required to maintain the cooperation.
Agreed,
came the reply.
Better to use them while they're useful and dispose of them when they become a liability. The Queen has no use for servants who cannot be trusted absolutely.
The casual discussion of genocide, for that was what they were contemplating, filled Meepo with the rage that threatened to override his caution. These humans spoke of his people as if they were livestock to be used and discarded, as if generations of Kobold history and culture meant nothing more than temporary convenience to their dark plans. But rage, however justified, would not help him complete his mission. The intelligence he had gathered was too important to risk through premature action, no matter how satisfying it might be to plant his spear between the shoulder blades of one of these casual monsters. His people were counting on him to return with information that could help them prepare for what was coming. The voices eventually moved away, leaving Meepo alone with his thoughts and the terrible knowledge he'd gained. The cult's plans were far more advanced than anyone had suspected. Their resources vastly greater than the scattered Kobold clans could hope to match through their conventional resistance. But they also had a weakness that a clever opponent might exploit: overconfidence, reliance on intimidation, and the kind of rigid thinking that came from believing their victory was inevitable. As he prepared to begin his escape from the tower, Meepo made a decision that would have surprised his elders and possibly horrified them. Rather than simply gathering intelligence and reporting back, he would take direct action to disrupt the cult's operations in whatever small way he could manage. It was not the cautious approach that Kobold tradition favoured, but these were not times where caution alone would be sufficient. The tower's supply of arrows provided the opportunity he needed. Each bundle was bound with cord that could be cut. Each arrowhead was attached with glue that could be loosened with the right kind of careful sabotage. It would take time for the damage to be discovered, but when it was, the cult would assume they were dealing with a human saboteurs rather than a single small kobold with a talent for mischief. Working by touch in the darkness, Meepo began the delicate work of rendering the cult's weapons unreliable without making his sabotage immediately obvious. Arrow points were loosened just enough to fail when the arrows were fired. Bowstrings were nicked in places where the damage could not be visible but would cause them to snap under tension. Each act of sabotage was small in itself, but together they would create the kind of cascade of equipment failures that could turn a well-planned operation into a chaotic disaster. And if the cult's rigid adherence to schedule forced them to proceed with compromised equipment, the results might give their opponents the advantage they needed to mount effective resistance. The work took longer than Meepo had planned, and dawn was beginning to lighten the sky by the time he completed his sabotage and began making his way back towards the drainage culvert that would provide his escape route. The tower was stirring to life around him, with guards changing shifts and early risers beginning their daily routines. It was during this transition that his presence was finally detected. Not by any failure of stealth on his part, but by simple bad luck. A cult member descending to the basement for routine supplies caught sight of movement in the shadows and raised an alarm that echoed through the tower's stone halls. "Intruder in the lower levels!" The shout rang out, followed immediately by the sound of running feet and shouted orders. "Secure all exits! Search every chamber!" Meepo's escape route through the drainage culvert was still available, but reaching it would require crossing an open area that was now filled with searchers carrying torches and weapons. His small size, which had been such an advantage during his infiltration, now worked against him. He could hide in spaces too small for humans to search, but he also couldn't move fast enough to outrun them on open ground. The solution, when it came to him, was inspired by the very stories his clan's elders had told around their evening fires. Tales of kobold heroes who had survived impossible odds through cleverness rather than strength, who had turned their enemies' expectations against them, who had proven that sometimes the best way to hide was in plain sight. The purple sashes worn by the kobold servants were stored in a chest near the tower's main entrance, ready to be distributed to any new recruits as they arrived. Meepo's infiltration had taken him past this chest multiple times, and he had noted its location as potentially useful information. Now, it became the key to his survival. Wrapping one of the purple sashes around his small frame, Meepo transformed himself from an intruder into what appeared to be one of the cult's kobold servants. The disguise was far from perfect. His weapons and equipment were wrong, his bearing too confident for someone who was supposed to be a mere labourer. But in the confusion of the search, it might be enough to get him past the guards and out of the tower. The gamble worked, at least initially. The searchers were looking for a hidden infiltrator, not a kobold servant going about his assigned duties. Meepo was able to walk past several groups of guards without attracting more than casual attention. His small stature and the purple sash marking him as someone beneath their immediate concern. But as he approached the main gate, his luck ran out. One of the human overseers who managed the Kobold workers recognized that Meepo was not one of the regular servants, and his shout of alarm brought every guard in the courtyard running toward the gates. "That's not one of ours!" the overseer yelled, pointing directly at Meepo with a finger that shook with rage and surprise. "Seize him! Don't let him escape!" What followed was a chase that would become legend among the Kobold clans. A desperate fight that tested every skill Meepo had learned during his months of solitary exploration. He abandoned the disguise and relied instead on speed, agility, and the intimate knowledge of terrain that his pursuers could barely navigate. The rocky outcrops around the tower provided numerous hiding places and alternative routes that were invisible to human eyes, but obvious to someone with Kobold heritage. Meepo used every advantage his people had developed through generations of survival in hostile territory. Narrow crevices that could hide a small body, climbing routes that required claws and a low center of gravity, knowledge of which rocks were solid and which would crumble under weight. The pursuit continued for hours, and the cult's human soldiers growing increasingly frustrated as their quarry seemed to vanish and reappear like a ghost made of stone and shadow. They brought dogs to track his scent. The rocky terrain made tracking difficult, and Meepo had learned techniques for masking his trail that his grandfather had taught him during their hunting expeditions. By midday, the searchers had given up and returned to the tower, convinced that whoever had infiltrated their stronghold had escaped beyond their ability to recapture. They were not entirely wrong. Meepo had indeed escaped their immediate reach, but he had not fled as far as they assumed. Instead, he found a hiding place within sight of the tower where he could observe their activities and verify that his sabotage was having the intended effect. The results were even better than he hoped. The loosened arrow points had been discovered when the guards attempted to test their weapons, leading to a complete inspection of the entire armory. The spoiled supplies had forced the cult to reduce rations and send out foraging parties to find replacement food. Most importantly, the cascade of equipment failures had forced them to delay their planned operations while they determined the extent of the sabotage and implemented additional security measures. But Meepo's greatest victory was not the disruption he had caused, but the intelligence he carried back to his clan. The maps and the documents he had studied revealed the true scope of the threat they faced, but also provided information that could be used to coordinate resistant efforts with other communities that were under threat. The journey back to his clan's territory took 2 days, during which Meepo had ample time to consider how to present his findings to the elders. They would be proud of his courage and ingenuity, but they would also be terrified by the implications of what he had discovered. The cult's plans threatened not just individual Kobold clans, but the entire way of life that his people had maintained for countless generations. When he finally reached the sacred caves where his clan made their home, Meepo was greeted as a hero, returned from an impossible quest. His clutchmates gathered around him with wide eyes as he recounted his adventures, while the elders listened with the kind of grave attention they typically reserved for discussions of ancient prophecies and tribal law.
"You have done well, young one,"
said Grandmother Kirk, the oldest and wisest of the clan's leaders.
"But the knowledge you bring us is heavy, with implications that extend far beyond our small territory. This is information that must be shared with others who have the power to act upon it."
"Others?" Meepo asked, his voice showing surprise. "What others?"
"There are those among the surface dwellers who oppose the cult's dark purpose,"
Grandmother Kirk explained.
"Humans, elves, dwarves, and others who value freedom more than the false peace that comes from submission to tyranny. Your intelligence could help them coordinate their efforts in ways not one single community can achieve alone."
The idea of working with surface dwellers was radical beyond anything Meepo had previously considered. Kobold tradition emphasized self-reliance and mistrust of larger folk, teachings that kept his people alive through centuries of persecution and neglect. But the threat they faced was too large for any single community to address through isolation and traditional methods. "How can we contact these surface dwellers?" he asked. And how can we trust them not to turn against us once the immediate threat has passed?
Trust must be earned through shared risk and common purpose.
The elder replied.
But sometimes the choice is between an uncertain alliance and certain destruction. The cult's plans, as you've described them, leave no room for communities that value independence.
The discussion continued through the night, the various clan members contributing their perspectives on the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. By dawn, they had reached a consensus that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The clan would reach out to potential allies among the surface dwellers, sharing Meepo's intelligence in exchange for inclusion in broader resistant efforts. The young kobold who had begun this adventure as a scout on a seemingly impossible mission had become something far more significant, a bridge between communities that had never trusted each other, a catalyst for alliances that could change the course of the conflict that was coming. As the sun rose over Greenfields, casting long shadows across a landscape that seemed peaceful but was actually poised on the edge of war, Meepo understood that his real adventure was just beginning. The courage that had carried him through his infiltration of the cult depot would be needed again and again in the days to come, as small folk and surface dwellers learned to work together against a threat that could only be defeated through unity. The dragon cult had underestimated the determination of those they considered beneath their noses. But they were about to learn that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the smallest creature could cast the longest shadows. And so, this tale draws to a close. Though its echoes may linger in your dreams, the fire burns lower now. But don't despair. I've countless more stories waiting to be shared with you. If this tale stirred something within you, if it reminded you why magic still matters in this mundane world, then please, light your own beacon. That glowing thumbs up tells the spirits of story that our fellowship grows stronger. Subscribe to join our circle permanently and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll know the moment I return with new chronicles. The fire burns brightest when more souls gather around it. Wouldn't you agree? Now, if that's the case, share this tale with another weary soul who needs it, reminding them adventure still exists. Tag a friend who would appreciate a good story by the fire. The more who believe, the more real these worlds become. And if you're new to our hearth, explore the playlist of chronicles that I've gathered. Tales of heroes and villains, love and loss, magic and mystery. Each one carefully chosen for souls like yours. Until the fire calls us together again, may your own adventures be worthy of legend, and may you never lose the wonder that brought you here tonight. Travel or sleep well, brave soul. The long rest awaits your return.